Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to this webinar in AT3's ICT Accessibility webinar series. I'm Marty Exline with the AT3 Center, which is the National Assistive Technology Act Training and Technical Assistance Center. We're happy to have you with us today for this important topic, accessibility and technology purchase and use decisions. Obviously, from websites to software to marketing materials like brochures and flyers, we rely a lot on third-party vendors to design and create a lot of our digital face. It's more important than ever, especially in the time of COVID and beyond, that we make sure that our vendor partners understand how critical it is for our digital materials to be accessible. Rob Carr will talk with us today about some of those questions and tools involved in multiple angles of a sometimes complex topic. And go ahead and jump to the next screen, Rob. Just a couple of reminders. If you do need captions, just click on the closed captioning button on the control panel. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and put those in the chat windows and we'll try to get to those as we go along. As far as upcoming events, registration links will be sent out via the AT3 listserv and also the ICT Community of Practice listserv. We will be sending out a post-webinar survey to everybody who's attending, and we'll also be sending out the link to this webinar along with the survey. So that should come out within just a few days. So with that, Rob, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Marty. Thanks, everybody, for joining us here today. As Marty said, please do use the chat for questions and feel free to drop those in anytime. I will try to take a break periodically and check, and I think I'll have some help also from the AT3 Center side with that. But feel free to drop those in at any time. There won't be any kind of a formal time for questions at the end or anything like that. So my name is Rob Carr. I was the program manager over technology accessibility for Oklahoma AbleTech. AbleTech is the Assistive Technology Act program for Oklahoma. I very recently, as in last week, started a new role at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, but I'm thrilled to have the chance to come in and deliver this webinar and finish out this series for this year. I know over the last few webinars, we had my former coworker and colleague, Lissa Prince, presenting, and I led off with a couple. I hope that these continue to be really, really valuable as time goes on. So we are going to lead off really big picture and thinking about what motivates this, what makes this a thing that we need to do. And the drivers behind this at a really high level are the civil rights laws that are in place that protect people with disabilities, or at least aim to protect people with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of their disability. So we've got the Americans with Disabilities Act that applies really, really broadly. It applies to state and local governments. It applies to quote unquote places of public accommodation, which are things like hotels and restaurants where the public comes in and has transactions and interactions. And then a little bit more narrowly focused at federal agencies and their contractors is sections 503 and 504 of the Federal Rehabilitation Act. The two sound a lot alike. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, really grew out of the Rehabilitation Act and took a lot of what's in there and applied it, again, more broadly to these different entities that weren't included under the coverage, under the umbrella of the Rehabilitation Act. With that, it's a whole other talk. Getting into these policies anymore is a whole other kind of training. You can become certified as an ADA coordinator. I just wanted to make you all aware that at a really high level, even in the technology space, the drive to not discriminate against those with disabilities comes from these civil rights laws. So we are talking basically about digital civil rights. Then we drill down a little bit, and as part of this conversation about accessible technology, we have web standards, and web standards tell us what an accessible thing should look and act like. Web standards include the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I will abbreviate that or shorten that down to WCAG. That's a set of standards, again, that says this is what a web page or a piece of software should look and act like. There are also authoring tool accessibility guidelines. If you work in the web space, if you work in an instructional setting, and you're creating different kinds of web content, there are actually standards that say, that dictate what accessibility looks like in the authoring environment. So if you publish a web page, the interaction that you have as a publisher, as a content author, has a set of standards that apply to it as well. Then there's a set of standards that applies to PDF content. PDF content is something that even when we're talking about vendor supplied things, it's often a part of the conversation. You might have a firm that creates brochures for you that you distribute as PDF. You might be creating your own. You might have a platform that creates reports in the PDF format, and we've got a set of standards called PDF UA that drive the accessibility work on that format in particular. There are a lot more. You'll probably hear me talk about WCAG mostly throughout the rest of our time together here. And then when we drill down a little bit more and we get more specific to procurement, we actually do see procurement policy at a few different levels. Another part of the Rehabilitation Act, Section 508, applies to federal agencies and their contractors. It actually applies a little bit more narrowly than a lot of people think. Again, whole other talk, whole other training, but it's out there and it's often cited in state policies. For example, in Oklahoma, where I still live, we have a state accessibility law that refers to Section 508 as it was revised in January of 2018. Your state may be in a similar situation. And the common theme between most of these policies is that we need to try to acquire the most accessible product that meets our business needs. So we have this broad civil rights charge to not discriminate in any setting. At the same time, the procurement policies allow for some flexibility in that. I'm an accessibility person, so I advocate really strongly to not minimize accessibility, but to in fact make it one of the things that you weigh really heavily when you're making these decisions. And that's really what the procurement policies generally do. So what's the scope of this? Well, really the scope of accessibility, whether we're talking about procurement or we're talking about doing our own internal work, includes anything digital. So anywhere there's a digital thing that goes out, whether it's through social media or email, whether it's internally facing or public facing, all of it needs to have accessibility as part of the conversation. Within the context of procurement, it doesn't need to be something that we actually buy either. Many technology tools are free, they're open source. This goes down to things like plugins for your website itself, software that you might install, although anymore that list is getting shorter as we move more and more to the web, to the cloud. But it also includes mobile apps, and it also includes hardware. If you have an informational kiosk, then there's good guidance, especially under Section 508, about how to account for accessibility in a device like that. So it is pretty broad. And what I've seen, I've been in higher ed since 2006, and I think it's happening as well in other sectors of the economy. And that is a trend to buy more, a trend not to develop as much in-house software, not to have software teams working, and to outsource a lot of the work, and to do that by acquiring products from vendors. Sometimes they are custom, but anymore as well, we have just more tools available to us that do things that help us get stuff done at work. And so over the last probably 5 to 10 years, I've seen a big drop in the number of things that people do in-house. And that even extends to an extent to marketing materials. I'm in the web and marketing shop at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. There's still a lot of work that comes out of our shop. There is still a need out there at times for folks to reach out and have design work done externally to the organization. So it is a pretty broad scope. And that really reinforces its importance. It's really easy to buy our way into discriminating against someone with our digital, because we don't include accessibility in that conversation from the very front. Meanwhile, the vendors that we purchase from, with rare exception, have zero legal obligation. There's a picture of a tumbleweed going down a dirt road here. The vendor legal obligations are none. Where we can oblige vendors to make sure that they are accounting for accessibility and that they give us the information we need to make a good decision is in our contracts. It's in our purchasing language that we use with different documents and different tools. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Just know that, again, with rare exception, there's nothing legally that directly applies to a vendor that says, yes, you need to make sure that you create accessible stuff. Sarah, I'll take this question real quick. If you have a website powered by Microsoft Azure, do we know if Microsoft follows accessible web standards, or is it up to each MIS software management company to make sure everything is accessible? So the first question, Microsoft has an accessibility team. That doesn't mean that every single tool is. I would, to answer your question, literally Google or use your search engine of choice and type in Microsoft Azure accessibility. That should bring up any documentation that Microsoft has about that particular tool. Generally speaking, they're pretty good about keeping documentation up to speed and accurate. Then as far as the next question, is it up to each software management company to make sure everything is accessible? You say MIS, would you mind in the chat spelling that out so I know the acronym? Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to be sure. Management Information System. It's up to, well, broadly, yes. I mean, it's up to the companies to do it, but the driver for that, it really comes from us. It really comes from those of us who are trying to purchase the products and saying in our contract language and in our requirements documentation that accessibility is part of the deal, that we need to make sure that the products are accessible. So the responsibility for it is ours as a client, but the people who have direct control over it, of course, are the vendors, whether that's Microsoft or a custom shop. So they are the ones that are responsible for making it happen. We have to drive the demand for that, though. There's not a legal obligation for them to do it. I will say, from everything I've seen with Microsoft, Adobe, Google, there are a lot of people now turning their attention to accessibility in a much more apparent way. And I think that that's just over the course of the last year and a half with everything that's happened. So check, individual products, like I say, check one to the other. I'll make a point about this a little bit later on. Just because a company does great with one thing doesn't necessarily mean that all of their tools are as accessible as they can be. The other thing that you could look for, and it might be published on the Microsoft site, is any kind of a roadmap or any kind of indication about what they're planning on doing with accessibility in the future. So don't assume, and this is just kind of reinforcing the point that I just made, don't assume that just because a vendor or a company has a lot of public sector clients, for example, that they do really well with accessibility. That's not always the case. And I've been in conversations with vendors that work with a bunch of public higher ed or a bunch of public state agencies, but accessibility is not something that is real high up on their list. So don't assume that because the audience for a particular company is mostly public sector or federal, that it's all good. We still need to ask about accessibility. And don't assume either, and this kind of, again, comes back to what I just mentioned with Azure, don't assume that every product is accessible because another one in that vendor's portfolio is. Acquisitions happen. Companies go out and buy smaller companies or complementary companies, and it might take a little bit for that product that was just acquired to meet even their internal accessibility standards. So we do have to take this very much product by product. There are some things that we can do to look more at the organizational level of maturity with accessibility, and I'll talk about that. But it's important to bear in mind that if we're talking about one product from a vendor, that we really need to keep focused on that one in particular. So how do we actually do this? My goal with anything in accessibility is to try to find places where we can inject accessibility into an existing workflow or an existing process. So that's the goal. Look for different places where you're already doing things around procurement and then build accessibility into them. And I'll give some examples as we go on here of what that might look like. So I've mentioned this a couple of times. It kind of literally starts a lot of the time with paperwork. most, especially large organizations, have a pretty robust process for procurement. If you're in government, you might find that it's an even bigger process. But the good thing about that is that that's usually scaffolding for accessibility coming into the fold. We can usually build accessibility on pretty effectively into things like a request for proposal or any kind of similar document that you'd send out to try to get it in front of vendors and have vendors come in and pitch their product or service. You could include it in a scope of work that has the definition of what needs to happen in this project, and making accessibility a requirement in the scope of work is also a really good way to keep it up front and in front of everybody as the conversation goes on. If you have separate requirements documentation, same thing applies, same thought applies as it does to the scope of work. And then, like I said a couple of minutes ago, the contract is really where we make this happen. In the RFP stage with scopes of work and requirements documentation, all of that stuff usually ends up in some form or fashion folded into a contract packet. It might be that some of it does. It might be that the contract is very much a standalone document for your organization. Really important to be sure that in that contract, you're really clear in stating that the product needs to be accessible, stating what set of standards it needs to be accessible to, and putting the onus on the vendor to make sure that they account for accessibility, that they provide a roadmap to you if they're not in a place where you're comfortable as far as accessibility in the product. So the contract is a key part of this. And I'll give you a resource at the end that has some sample language, forgot the word, has some sample language that you can use for several of these documents that might be helpful in thinking about how to actually form the language in a way that fits the need to uphold our end of the deal as consumers of these products, and also making sure that we're not taking too much on. And I'll give some examples of that here in a few minutes as well. Then you start looking at the actual product offerings, or you're looking at proposals. Weighing accessibility into your scoring is key as well. And I alluded to that before. It's really important to have measurements in place so that you can score accessibility and, like I said, weigh it pretty heavily in that decision. At least weigh it alongside the other considerations that you have, and not make it 5% of the weight. It does need to be a strong consideration. And then finally, any internal guidance that you have. So you might have policies that say, for example, you have the freedom to go out and use this tool in higher education and in other settings. A lot of times, if people aren't paying for something, they don't get any kind of help in vetting a product. So through policy and governance, you can come in and help to at least narrow some of those gaps and help the people that have the freedom to go out and acquire these free things, or maybe they're low enough cost that there's not a formal procurement process. With policy and governance, you can try to, again, narrow that gap a little bit so that people are at least thinking about accessibility and building it into their own individual or departmental thought process and decision making. That one's often a little bit trickier. In the public sector, you've got often a $5,000 cap before anyone else needs to be involved in a purchase. Well, $5,000 with software as a service and with the way things are priced can get you a ways, right? Without any help or any oversight from anyone else. So it's important to try to think of ways that will be feasible and beneficial to those who are out making those purchases, or again, using those free things and just making that decision. But again, that's usually through policy and governance, and ideally some guidance that you can provide about just how to do it, and a resource hopefully that can help when needed. So in these different documents, from the RFP to requirements to contracts, there are some pretty common elements between and among them from one organization to another. And the first is declaring the standards that you're aiming for. You'll see the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines in a lot of the examples out there. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are well, they have versions. So kind of like software, they have different versions. They actually are currently working on version 2.2, while at the same time working on a whole new set that they're going to call WCAG 3. What I recommend for folks is that if you can, then go to the latest version, which is actually 2.1. Version 2.1 is published and it's been vetted and it's out there. Really, WCAG 2.0 at the AA level is the minimum that I would go for. And I say that because that's what's in Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's what's in a lot of state laws, whether it's by reference or directly. So that's pretty much your floor. The 2.1 standards add some really, really helpful accessibility considerations, especially for those who have low vision or a cognitive disability. So it's a really good idea to try to nudge that forward. And at the same time, if you're doing that internally and you're building it into the requirements that you have, we're all communicating to vendors that, okay, it's time to move on to this little bit newer version. Even though 2.0 is what might be in your state law or federal law, it can be really helpful just in general to try to move the ball forward a little bit more and point to 2.1, and then hopefully not too long after 2.2 is issued that. But you might actually end up referring to Section 508, whether, again, you receive federal funding at the right level, and whether the web presence or whatever you're creating or acquiring on behalf of an agency, whatever that looks like, you could end up citing Section 508. And again, that state law or policy can be part of that citation. Typically, you want to ask for, and you will see a request, actually a requirement for some kind of documentation. The most common document that you'll see requested is called a Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, or a VPAT. I'm going to talk about the VPAT in a little bit more detail here in a few minutes. It's a really helpful tool that I actually think kind of gets a bad rap. People will lament VPAT's very existence, but I think there are some things that we can do as purchasers of software and web design and so on to make it a really effective tool. And then you'll see some kind of enforcement. And this is typically in the contract. There will be a set of possible outcomes if the vendor signs off and says, hey, we're accessible, this product is accessible, you get it. And whether you do some testing or you have someone with a disability come in and say, this is not accessible, the contract is where you're going to enforce this ultimately. And there are different ways of doing it. I've seen everything from a contract just being canceled, and that then sending the organization to look for a totally different tool, to coming in and saying, well, we have this problem, or your product has this problem. It wasn't documented anywhere. Can you give us a roadmap for your fix? Let us know what the timeline is like. Let us know how it's going to be released, and so on and so forth. That often comes down to the organization's kind of personality around procurement and around this kind of enforcement. You might look for things involving information security as a parallel to accessibility in procurement. And again, just kind of see what the comfort level is within the organization, because a lot of this comes down to organizational will, not just in the procurement side, but in general. Does the organization have the will to cancel that contract if the product doesn't come through as it was advertised when it comes to accessibility? So that's a big issue as well. That's a little bit bigger than the procurement conversation, but it does have a big impact on it. So the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, or the VPAT, this is basically a self-assessment that the vendor performs on a given product. And I would suggest that it be a mandatory part of your process, and that it's only the first step. Where I have seen organizations trip up a little bit is they'll ask for a VPAT, and then once they get it, they basically check the box that they got it and they move on, but no one has really looked at it. No one has taken it and done any vetting, even on paper. No one has really kind of gone through the feedback that the vendor provides. So it's not the only thing. The VPAT is not the only tool. And it's important to carry that message forward as well, because I do think that a lot of people, a lot of organizations look at it that way. You know, we have a VPAT, check that box, we're on to the next. We're on to the next phase of the procurement. It's a great first step in terms of vetting products for accessibility, but there is actually quite a lot more to it, depending on what kind of capacity you have, and depending on some other factors that I'll talk about here in a couple of minutes. The VPAT itself was first released, this new version of the VPAT was first released back in 2017, anticipating the changes that were coming out with Section 508, and looking at some of the different standards in Europe, as well as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's been updated a few times. In fact, the latest, greatest version, which I think is 2.4, does have a section for WCAG 2.1, that newer published set of standards that I mentioned. So you can, and I'll drop links into the chat, including this one near to the end, so you don't have to worry about jotting it down. But the VPAT itself is available from itic.org. So again, I'll put that into the chat a little bit later on, and I will go ahead and read the link out. It's itic.org/policy/accessibility/VPAT. So that page is the repository for your voluntary product accessibility templates. And for a while in Oklahoma, we actually had our own, because our standards were ever so slightly different than Section 508. And with our revised standards, since we align with Section 508, we can just go and use the Section 508 VPAT that's available here. This encourages a vendor to go through and determine the accessibility or lack thereof in each one of the standards. So ideally, the vendor does some legwork on this. John, thank you. John Brandt just dropped that into the chat. I appreciate it. But it asks the vendor to take on the responsibility for doing some assessment and for documenting what they find. So we'll get into that in a couple of minutes, because this is where I think the VPAT gets a bad rap. And I don't think it's the VPAT's fault, because sometimes vendors, not trying to be shady, I'm not anti-vendor at all, but sometimes a vendor will have somebody fill this out that might not know much about accessibility, that might not have the insight into the technical construction of a product or a website. So they might not be able to adequately answer these questions, which is why there are some additional steps that we need to take. So there are some key things in the VPAT that I think are really, really useful if we emphasize them. And there are some things here too that don't really require technical skill, much less accessibility knowledge. The VPAT asks up front for some pretty basic information. It asks for a product name and version. And right off the bat, your first question, or the first thing you should check, is to make sure that it's the same product and the same version that you might possibly buy. If it's a minor version difference, so if it's version 5.3 and you're on 5.4, then it might not be as big of an issue. I've had folks ask me to take a look at VPATs that were written 4 versions back. It's for version 2 and they're on version 6 now. At that point, to me, the VPAT probably isn't valid. So it's a thing that anyone can check to make sure that we're on the most current, or maybe one minor generation older version. The next thing to check is the date. I've had VPATs that were 2 years old. And my first question is this really still valid? Because generally in technology, 2 years is quite a while. Products change quite a bit. So checking the date and making sure that the VPAT is up to date is really helpful. Also, just because of the fact that technology changes, the testing that needs to be done to validate accessibility when those changes happen, if it's done 2 years ago, it's probably not valid because of the changes underlying it. So that's why the date is important, and also a really easy one to check. Anyone can validate or verify that the document, that the VPAT is current. Then ideally, and this is a step that vendors often don't take as seriously as possible, or they don't have anybody who really focuses on accessibility, but ideally in the contact information on the VPAT, the contact is an accessibility contact. And I say ideally because, like I just said before, a lot of the times vendors don't have anyone that has explicit and really detailed accessibility knowledge. So as a fallback to that, hopefully that there is a contact that is a little bit more technical, or if it's the sales team, you'll be able to work back and get to some of those more technical folks, because we're going to talk about how we might ask some questions here in a few minutes that they're going to need to answer. Then a big important question is about the evaluation methods that a vendor uses. So this asks the vendor to say, how are you validating accessibility in this particular product? And that's critically important, because if someone says, we validate using this accessibility tool and manual testing using these technologies or assistive technologies, if they are pretty specific, then I at least have more confidence. It doesn't mean that I'm good. I'm still going to go through everything else in the VPAT. But it does give me more confidence that I'm going to find less. I'm going to find fewer barriers to access. I have seen statements in this section, such as product knowledge, which doesn't really tell me much. That's when I'm going to fire back a question to say, no, really, please tell us how you validate this. You might find that folks have a third-party vendor that they've worked with that's done some assessment and consulting, and that might be one of the things that they include in this section. And that can be really, really good. It can be really helpful for the vendor, and it can help you feel better about the product that you're buying. Just make sure to vet then a little bit whoever they say has done the assessment. There are some product categories out there now that are being sold as a magic fix for accessibility, and it doesn't seem to be the case that they are. So, make sure then that you do ask a little bit about whoever's provided the validation, see if you can see it, if there's some kind of a more specific testing results report that they are willing to share. But this is another question that often kind of gets skipped or glossed over that I think we can use more and use more effectively to get a little bit more insight into what a vendor is doing with accessibility. And then you want to make sure that the standards that they have set as their own internal standard, this is the vendor, match up with yours. And that should be documented. Most of this is on one page of the VPAT. So it's pretty easy to find. It's all right there in one place. And I think that, it just kind of gets overlooked or glossed over a lot of times, and people go right to the test results when, again, if it's 3 years old, I want to get an updated one. I want to make sure that the product is still in good shape. So once we get into the VPAT, we get to conformance levels. And again, these will vary based on the standards that the VPAT uses as a foundation. The structure of the document, though, is the same no matter what. And at each standard, what a vendor can do is indicate that the platform, supports that particular standard, supports it with exceptions, does not support it, is not applicable, or was not evaluated. I see a lot of these short answers used, like I'll see supports. And then in the notes that they have, each one of the checkpoints basically has a place where the vendor can add notes. And I'll see a note that says it works everywhere but here. So I'm usually a little bit concerned about a VPAT when I see those kinds of discrepancies. I very rarely see not evaluated, strangely, when in fact there are not a lot. I have seen VPATs where the feedback is supports or supports with exceptions, and it doesn't bear out that way in practice. But these are the high level, more detailed kinds of responses that a vendor can put in. And then they should, and it's really valuable when the vendors do include some of those notes and are very specific about it, especially when you see supports with exceptions. Because the question that I always ask, if that's not really detailed in the VPAT, is, okay, well, what are those exceptions? And then what's your roadmap for getting those taken care of? So these are the kind of levels that they can indicate. And then you want to see more detail coming out of it. So getting the VPAT, like I said, is the first step. After that, and beyond the details we just talked about, we need to vet it. You can, I think, be pretty effective if you vet a VPAT, even if you don't see the product. I think you can glean a lot of information from it, as long as, again, it's not the only tool. So I already mentioned date, version of the product. Questions that I have fired back are about the remarks and explanations. That's where the vendors should make those detailed notes, especially if it's basically anything but supports. But even then, I'll still ask vendors specific information about how the tool or the platform does support a particular standard. And there I'm looking for that more technical insight. So if they say that it supports accessible forms, I'll ask how. And I know what I'm looking for with that more technical response. But I do want to make sure that I have insight into the methods that they're using, because again, there's some product overlays out there that aim to do quite a bit, and I'm not sure that they're reaching that target. So if that's the response, then I want to be sure that we're accounting for that as we're going through our decision-making process. And again, if a vendor says that something is not supported, ask for that timeline. And some of the things, if you have an accessibility expert in the room or in the Zoom, as it might be, then you can weigh some of these things against one another. Sometimes something won't support or will have a support with exceptions, and you'll find that it's actually not a deal breaker. It doesn't meet the technical conformance standard. However, as we've asked questions about it and discussed it, either we've identified a quick and easy fix, or it's not something that's going to prevent somebody from being able to interact with you. Remember, by policy, at least with the procurement policy, we're looking for the most accessible that meets the need. And so that leaves a little bit of room, understanding too that frankly 100% accessible is really rare, and if it happens, it usually is less than 100% the next day. So I expect, in terms of follow-up, working through this process with a VPAT, I expect 1 to 2 rounds of questions. And like I said, my questions are really nitpicky. That's kind of part of being in accessibility, is really digging into details. And I'll ask a question maybe for not every single one of the criteria, but for the majority of them, like I said, even if they say that the platform supports that particular standard, because I really do want to get as much under the hood of the product as I can without necessarily doing hands-on testing. And you'll, because of these more technical questions, find that you want to get technical staff communicating with technical staff. And that's why I said before, when you have that contact information, try to get to more technical folks. If they have an accessibility team, definitely try to work your way in with that group. But at some point, unless the sales team is really technical, they're probably going to figure it out organically that they need to bring in someone on the technical side. So look for that good implementation for the supported standards. There are ways to technically conform with standards that in the real world don't work, which is another reason I ask about supporting elements, because even if it's supported and it tests out okay, it could be in the real world that maybe there's a conflict with assistive technology, or maybe there's a conflict with the browsers where the standard is written as it is, but it's not actually implemented fully. And then when the things are not supported yet, when they have some stuff that they need to do, when you ask for those timelines or roadmaps, just make sure it's a timeline that you're comfortable with. And that's also the time to think about, okay, what kind of an accommodation might we need to provide for someone who has a disability if they encounter this barrier? How do we make sure that we've done everything we can to remove it or to minimize it? And then what do we need to do in terms of accommodations in this amount of time? And are we comfortable with that? That's going to be a part of your decision-making rubric as well. If it's a really big lift that you're going to have to carry for 8 months because it's going to take that long for the vendor to fix it, then is that really feasible? Or is it better to look for another product? What if they don't have a VPAT? This is less common of a response now than it was 5 years ago. I think that a lot of people in the tech space have, certainly in the last year and a half, become a lot more aware of accessibility and have a better handle on it. You're still likely to get a response like this. A VPAT isn't the only way to get documentation. And what a lot of vendors have at the ready is a more general accessibility compliance report. It should contain basically the same information. It might just follow a different format. It might be more of a narrative. But if your organization is comfortable with it, then it's certainly, I think, fine to accept another form of documentation. Just vet it as well, right? Similar train of thought as with the VPAT. Make sure that you've got folks who are reviewing it and you're firing questions into the vendor and vetting that document, whatever they might send. So it can add some more overhead, potentially, but the vetting process for the VPAT really should be rigorous enough that hopefully it's pretty similar in terms of the lift on the procurement team and on any tech or web staff that you have on your end. So one of the things that, and this might be a controversial take, one of the things I don't think is as beneficial as we commonly think is direct testing. And I say that because of a lot of variables in this conversation. So direct testing would be directly doing accessibility testing on, say, 3 candidate products. And it sounds like a really good idea. In my experience over the years, it's a little bit more mixed. One of the biggest things that I have found is that the version that I might be able to test might be not the full production version, right? Sometimes a demo that you can go in and use to get the look and feel of something doesn't have all the functionality. And I don't know at that point if that means that there are just some things missing, or if there is an entire underlying technology that's not implemented in that testing environment. So I think if you go into direct testing, even if you are using the same set of checks and you're using the same tools, it can be tricky. You just want to ask a lot of questions about, okay, is this what we're actually going to buy? Can we do everything in this that we can do in the production version? There's just a little bit more to take on there. And direct testing takes time. So I think it's important, if this is the approach that you are aiming for, to be sure that you scale the testing in such a way that it doesn't just make you fall over in a heap organizationally, because it can take a long time to go in and test even one platform. And so I think it would be really helpful then to scale your testing in such a way that you're testing for some of the biggest and most common things. Maybe you're not using a 40-point checklist. Maybe you're using a 15-point checklist. Maybe you run an automated checker that is a browser plugin and you tab through the page, whatever it is, or you go through specific and important workflows, because you'd end up in the testing business. If you do a lot of acquisition of software and technology, you'd probably have people that were just full-time testing candidate products. So I think it's helpful. I think it requires, again, more vetting to make sure that what you're testing is actually what you're buying, and then figuring out how to scale it. And remember, you're looking for relative accessibility. So if you run the same sets of checks, even if it's a smaller set, over 3 different candidate products, you're very likely to find the one that bubbles up to the top. So what about the test results? This is the controversial part, because in my head, I've been thinking quite a bit about not being smushed by testing, and what do we do with those results? Where I've landed right now, and someone may be able to talk me out of it for sure, is I don't think we should keep giving testing results away. What I've seen in the public sector a lot is that, say, an institution or an agency gets a product, they've done some testing when they were making the decisions, and they turn those results over to a vendor, whether they're paying them or not. I suggest we don't do that, especially at the decision-making point. I think that should be internal information that fuels the drive for accessibility for us internally, and that helps us to make an informed decision about accessibility in these products. I think that there are a lot of pitfalls to doing a bunch of testing for vendors who really, if we want to see test results, I think we should get in the habit. And I say we, because this is not something that one organization is liable to be successful doing. I think it would take a lot of us who do go out and buy products to start to say, we're going to do some testing. It's for our information. We'd love to see validation from a third party. We'd love to have you go to, one of these handfuls of vendors and have them do some validation for you. And that kind of takes you out of that part of the conversation, because we become free consultants a lot. And I see it happen quite a bit. And I understand where it comes from. It's because we're trying to protect ourselves as organizations from discriminating against people with disabilities. But I think that we should shift more of that onus to the vendors themselves, who hopefully have the resources to take that on, where we might not, where we might be splitting resources between our own work that we're creating that we need to keep tabs on, and the things that we are considering buying or that we have actually bought. So that's my advice. There are probably people watching this thinking that's ridiculous advice. And I understand that I probably can be talked out of this, but it's a big challenge to go out and test and to just give that stuff away. I think we should look for some different ways. Maybe even say, okay, look, we'll do some testing, give you some feedback. We buy the product after we buy the product, but we want to see some kind of a credit, because this is really valuable feedback to give. So I have a whole soapbox about it. I won't get on it right now. Another approach to helping vet beyond the VPAT is to set up an accessibility demonstration. And with that, that's where you bring in your accessibility expertise, you bring in your more technical folks, might be the same person or the same couple of people, and you'd have the vendor highlight some features in the product. So you're basically getting a demonstration of stuff that they have hopefully documented in a VPAT. And so the opportunity that's there is to basically have them, hopefully take the driver's seat and show some of the behind the screen about how they do actually meet standards, about what the impact of a barrier that they've documented that exists is. And then at that point, you can kind of steer them a little bit. If you're talking to more technical staff, you could potentially have them run an automated check and see a result and talk about some specific things. You could have them go in and do some inspection. If you're super techie and accessibility focused, you could have them open up the DOM inspector. And I know I got way too techie for a bunch of you right there, but you could have them start to pick through the behind the screen so you can actually see how stuff is built. We have one coming up on Friday with a vendor to see where they are with accessibility and to hopefully have an opportunity to see some of the stuff in action. You can ask them, hey, start tabbing around. Let's see what happens. And I've mentioned that a couple of times. What should happen when I use the tab key on a piece of software or a website is I should move around to all of the interactive elements. So any links or form fields or controls, and I should be able to move around without using a mouse. I should be able to actually make those controls work without a mouse. And so I could have the vendor do some things like that to demonstrate keyboard accessibility to me without having to do it myself. So it's not uncommon to ask for an accessibility demo, and it should be less common now for vendors to say, we don't know what that is. I don't think we can do it. But it's a really helpful way to get that insight. And I think it can be more useful than you doing direct testing because it's a conversation, right? And so as you see things and you have questions, hopefully they've got the folks on the call or in the room that can actually answer them right there in real time. It's a good way, again, to kind of gauge what an accessibility program looks like for a particular vendor. There's a comment. I see no, I need to read this first. I totally agree on not letting vendors off the hook with them testing their products and not us telling them / testing for them for free. Thank you. It's just a habit that we've fallen into, I think, as consumers. And as I said, I think it comes from a very good place. I think that it does kind of let vendors off the hook for something that we are requiring. With information security, we require a lot of documentation, and we vet that stuff. With accessibility, we might require the VPAT, but we might just file it away when we can do quite a bit more. Otherwise, we put a lot of that onus again on the vendor for them to take care of it, to build it into the products, and for them to report that to us as clients. So then you get the thing. Upon delivery, whatever it is, website, platform, whatever it may be, you get the thing. Actually, I'll pause before I move on here. Kevin asks, can you provide an example of a product you evaluated and the outcome? No, I can't. And I say it that way because typically there's an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, if I've done something officially, and I haven't done any product assessments for a while. And that's actually the most important part. if it's been more than about 6 months, then I don't want to say that this has been good or bad, because in that amount of time, it could have changed quite a bit. So I don't have anything that I feel like is fresh enough. And typically, I don't go on record stamping something one way or the other, because I don't know unless it's been really immediate, and I'm not real comfortable with it. So I'm sorry I don't have any examples for you there. And then someone reinforced that we should have the vendors take on the responsibility, and we shouldn't have to be the ones that are doing testing and such. So a couple of people are with me on this. So we get a thing, and it's delivered, it's rolled out, it's deployed, and it doesn't do what the VPAT says. So we've carefully vetted the VPAT, and it just doesn't pass muster. It doesn't say what it said it was going to do. So this is, again, where you want this process laid out in the contract. And the level of specificity might vary a little bit. What I mean by that is you might not have the full 20 steps that you would take detailed, but it's important, again, for that enforcement to be written into the contract. It sets an expectation, and it also gives you then recourse if they deliver something that doesn't do what, as I said, they said it was going to do. So I think you could look at, again, how significant and impactful are the barriers that you or someone else has found. Do you take the approach of keeping the product for a certain amount of time and having some specific assurances and deadlines in place for the vendor to remove that barrier before you just say, okay, we're out? Do you just say we're out and cancel the contract? I've seen that happen first person once. I think that a lot of organizations hesitate to bail on something because it's not accessible, while if it didn't meet another one of the scoring criteria, they might just say, nope, we're out, we're going back out to look for something else. So I think, again, this is a bigger thing than just looking at accessibility in procurement. And having that will as an organization to have these things, number one, built into your contracts, but also then to follow through. And then what other alternatives are out there? I think that's part of your decision-making process. There are products that really only do one thing, or they do one process, or they fit one niche, and they don't really have any competition. And in a case like that, if there's nothing else that meets the business needs, then you as an organization have a decision to make about, okay, what are our next steps? How do we accommodate somebody that has a disability? And it's, again, helpful to make sure that you know what the barriers are, you know about timeframes, and you have a plan in place for yourself as an organization, as well as with the vendor, hopefully, to see the remediation done, to see that barrier or those barriers removed from the product. And then back on the soapbox just for a couple of minutes. Few of the reasons that I think it's not good for us to become a free consultant is it communicates to vendors that accessibility should be free, that accessibility doesn't really have a lot of value, right? I mean, it's very much a matter of people do reflect what they value in the way they spend. It's kind of a direct measure, right? And so this communicates to vendors that they should expect to get this information for free, where if they went to the private sector and they engaged with an accessibility consultancy, I think it starts at around $150 an hour, probably. That's what I heard last. If anyone has more recent experience, then feel free to pop it in the chat. And then it goes up from there, depending on what the nature of the consulting actually is. So we have two different markets now, and we're telling vendors that, hey, we as purchasing entities are your free source for accessibility consulting. It's taking your team or an individual's time and expertise to turn around and with no compensation under the free model to build up the vendor's expertise, which I don't think is a sustainable model for us. So again, I think requiring third-party validation, third-party documentation of accessibility is a really good way to just wash your hands of the testing piece, or to figure out a way to actually be compensated. So as I said, some kind of discount on the purchase price, maybe you just directly invoice, something so that it's not happening for free, so that value is reflected. Because it really is still kind of a niche field. We still need more accessibility people. We've needed them for the 10 years I've been doing it, for years before that, and we're going to continue to have, I think, a shortage of accessibility experts out there. So it is valuable. My advice is to not become a free consultant, especially after the purchase, because that's when it typically happens. I've seen a pattern where you vet accessibility across candidate products and you get it delivered, and through some testing you find stuff that is broken, and you as an organization start immediately engaging the vendor and sharing your results, and there's no conversation about, hey, we got some stuff that's not right, we need you to validate it, or we can help, but we're not just going to give it away. So I've got a few links here. I see a comment in the chat. I'm actually going to hop out into the browser and show you each one of these. I think that all of these are really, really helpful in different ways. And so my aim is to leave you with some tools that you'll be able to go back and put to use. So I'm going to hop into the browser, and this is where I will put these into the chat. I see a comment here in the chat. Actually, Nicole says that agree with the vendor responsibility. 5 years ago, a platform that provided safe phishing and cybersecurity training had no VPAT. We did a proof of concept test, found it did not meet minimum standards, educated the vendor about what we needed. We did not purchase. 3 years later, they came back with a VPAT and a roadmap for everything not on par, and they made a 3-year contract. Yeah, I mean, and that's where I think there's room to speak to another point. I like having the room in your purchasing process to give vendors the opportunity to improve. You know, if it's just not accessible at all, or if there are massive, severe accessibility barriers, then that might not be feasible. You might have a candidate product that's better. But if there are some smaller things and people are comfortable with it, I think that in your contract, if it fits your organization, it makes sense to, again, ask for that roadmap and timeline and then hold them to it. That's the other thing as far as following through. Make sure that you actually do hold them to the timelines, the deliverables that they have. So this is the VPAT that I mentioned before, and I will drop these links into the chat as I show them to you. This VPAT landing page that I just put in the chat does, as I say, have different versions. So you've got one for the Section 508 standards at the US federal level. You've got the EN 301549, which is the European Union standard. You've got Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1. And then you have one that grabs all of these. So this will always have the latest, greatest version of the VPAT. And I think it's just helpful, again, to know what the VPAT is and to take it seriously and to use it as a tool. Because, again, it can be really effective. I think we just don't use it as well as we could. This next one is actually from the Access Board, GSA's accessibility program, the Government Service Association, section 508.gov. And it's a blog about building accessibility into your process. So it'll reinforce a little bit of what I've talked about and bring in some different angles as well. I think it's helpful to have different opinions and different approaches in front of you as you're trying to figure out how you might best move forward with this. Nicole, it's up there. The section 508. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to make it to not just the panelists. Thank you for saying that. This is actually the third one. So I did drop that. That's going to everybody. Let me just drop these other two in here real quick. So the one that I just dropped is from a group that was a grant-funded project that was a peer to WebAIM. If any of you all have heard of WebAIM in the accessibility space, they're a great group. And they go into another set of opinions about the importance of accessibility in procurement and some tips on how to do it. Now I'll drop in these others that I showed to the panelists, just not to everybody else. So now the link to the VPAT is there. Now the link to the Section 508 article is there. Sarah asks, have you found it difficult for organizations with smaller budgets to find a vendor to be held to accessibility standards? Sarah, do you mean the organization who's doing the purchase or the organization, the vendor that they're purchasing from? Yeah, if you have a smaller budget yourself, it can be a bit of the budget can be a constraint. I think it depends much more on the product category than it does the budget. So that someone might have different experience than I do, but I do think that it is more the product that you're looking to buy. The budget constraint is real for a lot of organizations. I think that with a lot of the licensing for software as a service, for cloud-based products and services, I think that it's brought the expense down. I think that's part of what's driven the kind of exodus of in-house development and design, especially software development for a lot of organizations. But I think it's less so the case now than in the past. It can still absolutely be a challenge, just because if you're talking with smaller vendors, especially for something custom, it can be more difficult to find people who know about accessibility. It can be tricky too, frankly, because if you're not a big client, if you're not buying or sending a pretty big check, then if the vendor's not getting those requests elsewhere, it can be tricky to put a lot of weight into it, right? To really sway the way that the vendor approaches or does not approach accessibility. So there can be some challenges, but I do think it's getting a little bit easier. One thing you might think about is within your sector of the economy, within what you're doing, see if there are other organizations who might be purchasing the same stuff, and see if you can't all kind of start to ask for the same thing, start to emphasize accessibility. We're over time. I'm going to drop these last 3 links into the chat. This Pete Works is from Department of Labor. There's some model procurement language for accessibility in procurement that I think is really helpful. And then there's an approach that, again, can be a separate thing from the state of Texas and other states have adopted, called policy-driven accessibility adoption, that could be helpful as well. We are over time. I thank you all for your time and for hanging out for an hour, whether it's live or in a recording. Yeah, very much appreciate your time. Very much appreciate the questions. And that's all I have. So I don't know, Marty or anybody on the AT3 side, if you want to sign us off, then we can go right ahead.
Sure, Rob. Thank you so much. And I think everybody wants to wish you luck in your new role also. I mentioned before that we will have send out to all the participants the recording of for the link recording, and then also a survey just about the webinar. We really appreciate when people respond to those surveys. And I think I don't see anything else in any of the windows. So thank you very much. Thank you for everybody who's attending. Thank you for, you've asked some great questions, and everybody have a fantastic afternoon.